One week after my father handed the family business to my irresponsible younger brother, I watched our biggest client walk into my new office, place a contract on my desk, and say, "Rachel, we're moving with you." That was the moment I realized my father had made the biggest mistake of his life. He thought he was choosing his son over his daughter. What he actually did was hand me the freedom to take everything I had spent 15 years building and finally build it under my own name. Before we get into the story, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have believed in you, take a second to subscribe. Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't destroying someone, it's simply succeeding without them. My name is Rachel Vance. I'm 36 years old, and for 15 years, I helped build my father's company from a struggling local firm into one of the most respected businesses in our region. I knew every major client, every supplier, every employee, every account. I knew which customers wanted a phone call instead of an email. I knew which contracts were about to expire. I knew which vendors would forgive a late payment, and which ones would quietly blacklist you for it. I knew the business because I had practically lived inside it. My father knew that. That's what made what happened next hurt so much. The company was called Vance and Associates. My grandfather had started it 38 years earlier with a rented office, 2 desks, and 1 employee. My father, Richard Vance, had taken it over when he was 31. By the time I joined, it had become a serious operation, not a giant corporation, but profitable, stable, respected, and most importantly, trusted. My father used to tell me that trust was the only asset a business couldn't buy back once it lost it. I believed him. Apparently, he didn't. I started working there when I was 21. At first, I wasn't even supposed to be part of the management team. Dad told me I needed to earn my place. So I did. I arrived before everyone else. I stayed late. I learned the accounting software. I sat in meetings where nobody introduced me. I answered phones. I organized files. I traveled to clients who barely remembered my name. And slowly, year after year, I became useful, then indispensable. By the time I was 30, I was running operations. At 32, I was managing our largest accounts. At 34, I had negotiated 3 of the company's biggest contracts in its history. And at 35, I thought I knew exactly where my career was going. I thought my father was preparing me to take over. I was wrong. The problem had always been my brother, Daniel. Daniel was 32. He was charming, funny, confident, and completely unreliable. If I was the person who kept the company standing, Daniel was the person who occasionally walked into the building and received applause for it. He had worked for Dad on and off since he was 24. Mostly off. He'd disappear for months, start some new project, quit, travel, come back, ask for another chance. And every time, Dad gave him one. I never complained. At least, not at first. I told myself Daniel was younger. He needed time. He would mature. Maybe Dad simply had a different relationship with him. Then one Monday morning, everything changed. I walked into my father's office carrying a folder containing the final paperwork for our largest contract of the year. Dad was sitting behind his desk. Daniel was sitting across from him. That immediately bothered me. Not because Daniel was there, because the door was closed. And Dad looked nervous. I put the folder on his desk. "Good morning." Dad looked up. "Rachel, sit down." I sat. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He had that smug little smile he always wore when he knew something I didn't. Dad folded his hands. "I've made a decision about the future of the company." I remember the exact sound of the air conditioner, a low mechanical hum. I remember the clock on the wall, 9:17. I remember thinking, this is it. For 15 years I'd imagined that conversation. I imagined Dad saying he was proud of me. I imagined him handing me the keys. I imagined us standing together in the office my grandfather had built. I imagined hearing, "You're ready." Instead, Dad said 5 words. "Daniel is taking over the company." For a few seconds, I genuinely didn't understand. I looked at Daniel. He smiled. Then I looked back at my father. "What do you mean?" Dad cleared his throat. "I mean, I'm stepping back. Daniel will become president." I stared at him. "President?" "Yes." "And what will I be?" There was a pause. Too long. "I'd like you to remain as operations director." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain didn't know what else to do. "Operations director? Rachel, after 15 years?" Daniel finally spoke. "Come on, Rachel. Don't make this weird." I turned toward him. "Make what weird?" He shrugged. "You know what Dad means. He wants family involved." I looked at my father. "I'm family." Dad sighed. "Of course you are." "No, you just said you wanted family involved." Silence. Then Dad said the sentence that I would remember for years. "Daniel is my son." My stomach dropped. There it was. Not performance, not qualifications, not experience, not results. Blood. Male blood. That was the qualification I hadn't been able to compete with. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. I curled my fingers into my palms. "Is this final?" Dad nodded. "Yes." I stood. Neither of them said anything. I picked up my folder. The contract I'd negotiated. The contract that was going to generate nearly a quarter of our annual revenue. I looked at Dad. "You know what the worst part is?" He didn't answer. "I spent 15 years thinking you were teaching me how to run this company." My voice cracked. "I didn't realize you were teaching me how to run it for your son." Daniel rolled his eyes. Dad looked away. That was when something inside me went quiet. Not broken. Quiet. I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in the hallway. I went into my office, closed the door, sat down, and stared at the wall. For 15 minutes, I did nothing. Then I opened my laptop. I looked at the company's financial reports, client list, contract history, growth charts, profit margins, everything I'd built. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been too afraid to ask before. What if I didn't need them? That question changed everything. Because my father thought he'd taken something away from me. He hadn't. He had finally shown me that I was the thing keeping the entire business alive. And once I understood that, I stopped thinking about how to get my father's approval. I started thinking about how to leave. Quietly. Legally. Completely. I didn't know it yet, but within 10 days, almost every major client my father thought belonged to him would be sitting across from me, and my brother would finally discover what happens when you inherit a business without inheriting the people who made it successful. But first, I had to walk away from 15 years of my life without giving them any warning, and that was harder than it sounds. Because leaving wasn't just quitting a job, it meant leaving my grandfather's company. My father's company, my childhood memories, my identity. For years, I'd told people, I work at my family's firm. I never realized how much of myself was tied to those words. That evening, I stayed late. The office emptied around me. One by one, lights clicked off. Employees said goodnight. The parking lot became almost completely empty. I remained at my desk. I opened a blank document. At the top, I typed, "Rachel Vance, transition plan." Then I stopped. I stared at those words. My hands were still shaking. I could resign immediately. Walk out. Tell everyone what Dad had done. Make a scene. Expose Daniel. But something stopped me. I remembered my father's favorite saying, "Never make a move when you're angry." So I didn't. I spent that night doing something much more dangerous. I became patient. I reviewed my employment agreement. I reviewed every confidentiality clause. Every non-solicitation provision, every client contract. I contacted an attorney the following morning. Her name was Laura Bennett. I'd known her professionally for years. She was one of the sharpest corporate attorneys in the city. I sat across from her in a small conference room while she read through my documents. Finally, she looked up. "Rachel, what exactly do you want to do?" "I want to leave." "That's easy." "I want to start my own firm." She nodded. "Also possible." "And I want to know whether I can work with clients who choose to follow me." Laura leaned back. "That depends entirely on how you approach it." "I won't steal anything." "Good." "I won't take confidential documents." "Good." "I won't breach existing contracts." "Good." "And I won't contact anyone until I'm legally allowed to." She studied me. Then she smiled slightly. "Then you aren't talking about stealing clients?" "No." "You're talking about building a competing business?" "Yes." "And if clients independently choose to move?" I nodded. "Then that's their decision." Laura smiled. "Now we're having a different conversation." That meeting lasted almost 2 hours. When I left, I had something I hadn't had when I walked into my father's office: a plan. I didn't need revenge. I needed freedom. The revenge would happen naturally, but freedom required preparation. Over the next 4 days, I did something nobody at Vance and Associates noticed. I worked harder than I ever had. I finished every outstanding project. I documented every process. I organized every file that belonged to the company. I made sure no one could accuse me of sabotage. Then, on Friday afternoon, I walked into my father's office. He was on the phone. I waited. When he hung up, he looked at me. "What's up?" I placed an envelope on his desk. He looked at it. "What is this?" "My resignation." His face changed. "You're quitting?" "Yes." "Rachel, don't be ridiculous. I've made my decision." "You're upset." "I was upset Monday." "And now?" "Now I'm certain." He stood. "You're making a huge mistake." I almost smiled. That sentence stayed with me, because for 15 years I'd heard that I wasn't ready. Now, when I finally walked away, suddenly I was making a mistake. I looked at him. "I hope Daniel does well." Dad frowned. "You're really gonna do this?" "Yes." "After everything I've given you?" I felt something cold move through my chest. "Everything you've given me?" He didn't answer. I continued. "I gave you 15 years. Dad's jaw tightened. "I gave this company 15 years. I picked up my bag. "And apparently, that still wasn't enough to make me your choice." I walked toward the door. Then Dad said something behind me. "You'll come back." I stopped. I turned around. "Why?" "Because you'll realize you need us." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled. "No, Dad. I think you're going to realize you needed me." And I walked out. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I ever worked for my father. And exactly 1 week later, the first major client would leave with me, then another, then another. Until Daniel finally understood the difference between owning a company and actually having a business. The first Monday after I resigned, I woke up at 4:38 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to shut down. For 15 years, my mornings had followed the same routine: coffee, email, traffic, office, problems, solutions, meetings, more problems. I had built my entire life around that rhythm. Now I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd just thrown away everything I'd worked for. At 6:15, I finally got up. I walked into my kitchen, made coffee, and stood by the window. The city was still dark. For the first time in 15 years, I had nowhere I was required to be. And strangely, that freedom terrified me. I sat down at my dining table with my laptop. My new company didn't have a fancy name yet. It didn't have employees. It didn't have an office. It didn't even have a logo. What it did have was me, and 15 years of experience. I opened the document Laura had helped me prepare: business plan, startup costs, legal structure, projected revenue, potential office locations. I stared at the numbers. If I failed, I could lose everything I'd saved. If I succeeded, I would finally have something that belonged entirely to me. I whispered to myself, "You've already built it once." Then I corrected myself. "No, I've built it 15 times. Because every time the company grew, I was there. Every major account, every crisis, every expansion, every difficult client, every employee who needed training. I had been doing the work. My father had simply been holding the title. That realization gave me the courage to make the first call. By Tuesday afternoon, I had registered my new firm, Vance Strategic Solutions. I deliberately kept the name professional and separate from my father's branding. No family logo, no references to the old company, no attempt to pretend I was still connected to them. I wanted everything clean, legitimate, mine. The next step was an office. I found a modest suite about 15 minutes from my father's building. It wasn't impressive. There was no marble lobby, no giant reception desk, no expensive furniture. Just 4 rooms, large windows, and enough space for a small team. I loved it. I signed the lease. Then I sat alone in the empty office. The silence was almost overwhelming. I looked at the bare walls. For 15 years, I'd worked in an office filled with photographs of my grandfather, awards my father had won, and framed newspaper articles about the company's growth. Now there was nothing. No history, no expectations, no family name hanging over me, just 4 white walls. I smiled. This is mine. And for the first time since my father's announcement, I felt something other than anger. I felt excitement. But I knew something important. I couldn't simply call clients and ask them to leave. That would be reckless. So I didn't. I waited. And I watched. The first sign came sooner than I expected. Wednesday morning, my phone rang. It was Mark Ellison. Mark had been one of our largest clients for almost 9 years. He was the kind of client who hated unnecessary meetings. He hated salespeople. He hated being pressured. But he trusted me. When I answered, he said, "Rachel, what's going on?" I leaned back in my chair. "What do you mean?" "I heard you left." "Yes." "Why?" I paused. "Personal decision." He was quiet. Then he said, "Is Daniel running things now?" "Yes." Another pause. "That's unfortunate." I almost laughed. "Mark." "No, I'm serious." He sounded irritated. "Your father knows what he's doing, right?" "I hope so." Mark sighed. "Are you starting something?" I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "Yes." "Good." I frowned. "What?" "Good." He continued. "Because when our contract comes up for renewal, I'm calling you." My heart started pounding. "Mark, I haven't even started taking clients yet." "I know. And I don't want you doing anything that violates your current agreement." "Rachel, I've been working with you for 9 years." His voice softened. "I don't care what company name is on the invoice." That sentence stayed with me, but I still didn't celebrate, because one client wasn't a company. Then Thursday came. I received an email from another major account. Then another. Not requests to leave. Questions. "Are you still consulting? Will you be available independently? Are you opening another firm? Can we work with you directly?" I forwarded every message to Laura. She replied with the same advice every time. Do not solicit. Do not encourage. Do not discuss confidential information. Let them make their own decisions. So I did. I answered politely. I told them I was establishing a new firm. I told them I couldn't interfere with their existing agreements, and I left the decision entirely in their hands. That was the part my father never understood. He thought clients belonged to him. They didn't. They belonged to themselves. And they were free to choose who they trusted. Friday morning, I received a call from someone I hadn't expected. My father's CFO. His name was Michael Grant. He had worked at Vance and Associates for 11 years. He didn't even say hello. He said, "Rachel, how bad is this?" I stood up. "What do you mean?" "Daniel." I closed my eyes. "What happened?" Michael lowered his voice. "He fired the operations manager." I frowned. "Why?" "He said the position was unnecessary." "That position handles vendor coordination." "I know." "And payroll scheduling." "I know." "Then why would he?" "Because he said you did it before." I sat down. Michael continued. "He's been changing procedures all week." My stomach tightened. "Which procedures?" "Almost everything." That wasn't good. Daniel had never understood that businesses weren't machines. You couldn't simply replace a person and assume the process would continue. There was institutional knowledge, relationships, timing, trust. Michael sighed. "And he told everyone the company is going to become more aggressive." "What does that mean?" "He wants to cut costs by 20%. I rubbed my forehead. "That's insane." "I know." Then Michael said something else. "Rachel, I think you should know something." "What?" "3 employees are already looking for other jobs." I stared out the window. I had expected Daniel to struggle. I hadn't expected him to unravel the company in 5 days. Then Michael whispered, "Your father is furious with you." "Why?" "He thinks you're trying to destroy him." I felt a strange sadness. "I haven't done anything." "I know." Michael paused. "That's why he's scared." That night I barely slept. Not because I was afraid, because I could see what was happening. The company wasn't collapsing because I had left. It was collapsing because the person Dad chose couldn't do what I had been doing, and I had to be careful. Because there was a fine line between watching a competitor fail and enjoying it too much. I didn't want to become cruel. I didn't want to sabotage my father. I wanted to prove something, to myself, that I had never needed his permission to be capable. Monday morning marked exactly 1 week since my father had announced Daniel as president. At 8:03 a.m., my new office phone rang. I answered. "Vance Strategic Solutions." "Rachel?" "Yes." "This is Mark Ellison." I smiled. "Hi, Mark." "I've made a decision." My heart began pounding. "What kind of decision?" "I want to move our account." I closed my eyes. "Mark, you don't have to do this because I left." "I know." "Then why?" "Because the person I hired was you." I couldn't speak. He continued. "I don't trust Daniel." "That's not my place to comment on." "Fine." He sighed. "But here's what I do know. You understand our business. You know our history. You know our priorities." He paused. "I don't want to start over with someone who doesn't know any of that." I swallowed. "Thank you." "No, thank you." The contract was signed that afternoon. It was my first major client, and it was worth more than I had expected. But the real shock came Tuesday. At 9:20 a.m., 3 people arrived at my new office. They were executives from another major account. I hadn't called them. I hadn't emailed them. I hadn't approached them. They had simply come. They sat across from me. One of them placed a folder on the table. "We want you to handle our account." I stared at the folder. "You've already reviewed my proposal?" "We didn't need one." I looked at them. "Why?" One of them smiled. "Because we've watched you run our account for 6 years." Then came the sentence that nearly broke me. "We followed you because you were the reason we stayed with Vance and Associates in the first place." I looked down. For 15 years, I'd thought my value depended on my father's company. Now clients were proving the opposite. My value had never belonged to the company. It belonged to me. By Wednesday, I had 5 major accounts in discussion. By Thursday, 2 more. By Friday, I had enough signed business to hire 3 employees. I still hadn't contacted a single client from my father's firm. Not one. Every move had come from them. And that made what happened next even more satisfying, because my father couldn't accuse me of stealing anything. There was nothing to accuse me of. The clients were choosing, and they were choosing quickly. Meanwhile, Daniel was making things worse. One of our former suppliers called me. I didn't answer. They left a voicemail. "Rachel, this is Tom. We need to talk." I called him back. He sounded exhausted. "Daniel changed our payment terms." "What did he do?" "He wants 60-day terms. That supplier has always required 30. "I know." "Did he negotiate?" "No." I sighed. "What did he say?" Tom laughed bitterly. "He said we're the largest client." I closed my eyes. "That isn't how negotiations work." "I know." Then Tom said, "Rachel, what happened to him?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. Maybe nothing happened to Daniel. Maybe we'd simply been protected from seeing who he really was. My father had always cleaned up his mistakes, paid his debts, covered for missed meetings, explained away his failures. I had mistaken that protection for potential. Now there was nobody left to clean up after him, except Dad. And Dad couldn't clean up fast enough. The first real confrontation happened the following Monday. My father showed up at my office. No appointment, no warning. He walked through the glass doors with a face I'd never seen before. Angry, embarrassed, afraid. I stood from my desk. "Dad." He didn't sit. "How many?" I knew exactly what he meant. "I don't know. Don't lie to me." "I haven't contacted your clients." "That's not what I asked." He stepped closer. "How many accounts have moved?" I looked at him. "That's confidential." He laughed. "You're really doing this?" "Doing what?" "Taking everything." I felt my jaw tighten. "I didn't take anything." "You're destroying the company." "No." I pointed toward the door. "You did that when you chose someone who couldn't run it." His face hardened. "You think you're better than your brother?" "No." I paused. "I know I'm more qualified." He stared at me. Then he said, "You've always been jealous of him." That one hurt. More than I expected. I felt it physically. A pressure in my chest. Because there it was. After 15 years. After every late night. Every successful contract. Every crisis. He still thought my motivation was jealousy. I walked around my desk. "Do you want to know what I was jealous of?" He said nothing. "I was jealous that Daniel could fail and still be loved." My voice started shaking. "I could succeed 10 times and still have to prove myself." Dad looked away. "I wasn't jealous of Daniel." I swallowed. "I was jealous of the fact that you never made him earn what you gave me." Silence filled the office. Then Dad said, "You're making a mistake." I shook my head. "No." I looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm finally correcting one." He left, but the confrontation changed something. Until that moment, part of me had still wanted him to understand, to admit he had been wrong, to say, "Rachel, I should have chosen you." After he walked out, I realized something. I didn't need that anymore. Because the clients had already answered the question, the employees had answered it, the numbers had answered it, and most importantly, I had answered it. I could build something without him. But the story wasn't over, because my father wasn't going to sit quietly while his company disappeared. He had one last weapon. He decided to challenge my new business legally. Laura called me on Thursday morning. Her voice was unusually serious. "Rachel, we have a problem." I froze. "What happened?" "Your father sent a formal letter." "What does it say?" "He claims you're violating your previous employment agreement." My stomach dropped. On what basis? He alleges you're using proprietary client information. I sat down slowly. That isn't true. I know. Then what do we do? Laura was silent for a moment. Then she said, "We defend you." I looked at the stack of contracts on my desk. My heart was pounding. This was the moment I'd been afraid of. Not losing clients, not losing money, not even losing my father's approval. Being dragged into a legal fight with my own family. For the first time since I resigned, I wondered if I'd gone too far. Then Laura said, "Rachel? Yes? There's something you need to understand." "What?" "You've done everything correctly." I exhaled. "But that's not all." "What do you mean?" "I reviewed the records." She paused. "Your father may have just made a very serious mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "The clients aren't your biggest problem." I frowned. "Then what is?" "Your documentation." I didn't understand. "What about it?" "Rachel, when you left, you documented every process, every account transition, every pending issue, every outstanding obligation." "Yes, that's exactly what we need." She continued. "Because if your father claims you sabotaged the company, we can show that you did the opposite." I leaned back. For the first time in days, I smiled. My father had spent 15 years believing documentation was boring administrative work. I had spent 15 years documenting everything. Now those records were about to become the difference between an accusation and the truth. The legal battle lasted weeks. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make these things dramatic. There were no screaming courtroom scenes, no shocking confessions. There were emails, contracts, dates, invoices, employment agreements, meeting notes, everything boring, everything precise, everything undeniable. And every time my father's attorneys claimed I'd taken something improperly, Laura produced documentation proving otherwise. Then came the most important evidence of all. Client statements. One after another, our former clients confirmed that they had independently approached my company. They had made the decision. They had initiated contact. They had chosen to leave. My father couldn't stop them. Nobody could. And eventually, the legal pressure disappeared. But by then, the damage to Vance and Associates was already done. Within 3 months, more than 70% of the firm's major revenue had moved elsewhere. Not all to me. Some clients simply left the industry. Some went to competitors. But enough followed me that my small 4-room office became too small. I hired more people, moved into a larger building, expanded into 3 cities, and eventually, I stopped thinking about my father's company entirely. Until one afternoon, almost a year later, I received an email. It was from Dad. Just 3 words. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, "Okay." We met at a quiet restaurant. He looked older, much older. His hair had gone almost completely gray. He sat across from me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "I was wrong." I looked at him. I had imagined hearing those words thousands of times. In my imagination, they had always felt satisfying, but sitting there, they didn't. They felt sad. "I should have given you the company." I said nothing. I thought Daniel needed it. I finally asked, "Why?" Dad looked down. "Because you're strong." I frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It does to me." He sighed. "I thought you'd be fine no matter what happened." My chest tightened. "And Daniel?" "He was never as confident." I looked at him. "So you gave him the company because you were afraid he would fail?" Dad nodded. "And you were willing to let me feel like I wasn't good enough because you knew I'd survive it?" He didn't answer. That was answer enough. I stared at the table. For years, I'd thought my father had chosen Daniel because he loved him more. Maybe the truth was more complicated. Maybe he had simply underestimated what his daughter could survive. But love doesn't erase injustice, and an explanation doesn't erase 15 years of hurt. I looked at him. "Are you proud of me?" He immediately said, "Yes." I smiled sadly. "You should have told me that 15 years ago." His eyes filled with tears. "I know." That was the moment I finally let go. Not because he apologized, not because he admitted I was right, but because I realized I no longer needed him to validate what I already knew. I had built a company. I had built a team. I had earned the trust of hundreds of clients. I had created something my children could one day inherit if they wanted it. And I had done it after being told I wasn't the right person. My father had once told me I would come back because I needed them. He was wrong. I didn't come back. And eventually, I understood the greatest irony of the entire story. My revenge wasn't taking his clients. My revenge wasn't watching Daniel fail. My revenge wasn't proving my father wrong. Those things were satisfying. But they weren't the point. The point was that when my father closed one door, I stopped standing outside it. I built another door, then another building, then an entire company. And I never asked permission to walk through it. Today, Vance Strategic Solutions has more employees than my father's company ever had when I left. Sometimes people ask me whether I regret resigning. I always give them the same answer. Not for a second. Because if my father had chosen me that morning, I probably would have stayed. I would have spent another 20 years trying to prove I deserved the position. I would have continued carrying responsibilities while someone else carried the title. And I might never have discovered what I was capable of without the family name behind me. So yes, for a long time I thought my father had taken my future away. Eventually, I realized something different. He had accidentally given it back to me, and the day I stopped trying to earn my father's approval was the day I finally became my own boss. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't making someone regret hurting you. It's becoming so successful without them that their rejection no longer has any power over you. And if there is one thing I learned from 15 years inside my father's company, it's this: never confuse someone's decision not to recognize your value with a lack of value, because sometimes the person who underestimates you isn't seeing your limitations, they're revealing their own. And one day, they may look around and realize that the person they thought they could replace was the person holding everything together. That was what happened to me. My father chose his son. I chose myself. And in the end, I was the one who built the future. If you've ever been underestimated by family, betrayed by someone you trusted, or told you weren't good enough, remember Rachel's story. Sometimes you don't need to fight for a seat at someone else's table. Sometimes you need to build your own. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in Rachel's position. And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, family drama, revenge, and satisfying justice, subscribe for the next one. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who already has a plan.